Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Daniel's prophecy and the kingdom in our continuing course on end times prophecy. Exodus chapter 19, this is by way of preface before we get to Daniel, speaks of a kingdom. He says, God says to Moses, "Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine." So notice, you're going to be my possession. And that's no big thing because everything is already the possession of God, but you'll be my special possession. And you shall be to me, and here it is, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So Israel was called to be a special possession, a kingdom of priests. Remember, a priest is somebody who represents the people to God. He's not like a prophet. The prophet comes from God and represents God to the people. The priest represents the people to God, is sort of the holy representative. And Israel was called to be that for the world. Isaiah chapter 9, 6, a second passage that talks about this idea of a kingdom. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given. Notice that's parallelism. So to be born, to be given a child, a son, this is speaking of the same thing. The government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called. Now, I know some modern translations want to render this wonderful counselor. Actually, the way in Hebrew, the way you do an adjective is you put the descriptive afterwards, and the fact that it has wonderful before, and it does in the Hebrew as well, maybe leads me to believe that it's not just wonderful counselor. His name will be called wonderful and counselor and mighty God and eternal Father and Prince of Peace. So I think the King James probably had it right there, at least by the standard rules of the way you normally interpret Hebrew. Verse 7 goes on, there will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom. So notice this is going back to the Davidic covenant. You say, well, I thought the descendants of David broke the Davidic covenant. Remember, Solomon went and worshipped other gods. But in spite of that, there's a better son of David who comes along. I think this is Jesus, on the throne of David over his kingdom to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So, who is the one that's on the throne of David? I think this is speaking of the greater son of David. This is Jesus. And now we come with that idea in mind, we come to Daniel. What we're going to look at specifically is Daniel chapter 7 and beginning in chapter 7 and verse 1. We'll go to chapter 8 as well. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. So this is taking place not in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, but a couple of generations later. This other person, Belshazzar, is now reigning. Actually, he's second in command. His father's off and doing some archaeology down in Arabia, but that's not really part of our story. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Now, when you hear about the sea, especially if you're looking for symbolic significance, remember that the Jewish people were not an ocean going people. They didn't usually go out in the ocean. Every single time in the Bible you see a Jewish person getting into a boat, it always ends up bad. And so the sea was a dangerous place, and it was a place where there were storms and dangers, and the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts were coming up out of the sea from different from one another. So out from this dangerous place comes dangerous beasts. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. So he sort of encompasses both a lion and an eagle. It's interesting how we have in Babylon, and I think this does represent Babylon, this imagery. It would be a bit like saying, and I saw the American eagle coming out of the sea. Well, who does that represent? Well, here in this case, it represents Babylon. And we don't have to guess. We're going to be told what these represent. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was also given to it. That reminds me of Nebuchadnezzar, who basically built up the Babylonian Empire. It had been a city already. He's the one that made it into an empire, but it's not going to be an empire that lasts. And so, verse 5, and behold, a second beast, another beast, a second one, resembling this time a bear, great big animal. In fact, a bear is one of the largest dangerous animals. Now I know they're like there's the blue whale and thing, but those aren't particularly dangerous. Just stay out of their way, and they don't. But a bear can be, and it was raised up on one side, and three ribs were in its mouth. Sort of reminds me of Persia and the Medes, and also the Lydians way over in what today is Turkey. The Persians actually pulled those three areas together and fashioned a big empire together. Now, I'm not saying for sure that's what's being in view here, but three ribs were in its mouth between its teeth, and thus they said to it, arise, devour much meat. Verse 6, after this I kept looking, and behold another one, like a leopard. Now, he's not seeing a leopard or a bear, but or a lion, but things that were like those things. And a leopard, which had on its back four wings. So here's a leopard built for, well, a leopard by itself is built for speed. This is built for extra speed. This has a leopard, which is the fastest land animal in the world. And then it's got wings to make it even faster. The beast also had four heads, and dominion was given to it. I think we're going to see, and this will be explained later on, I think we're going to see a picture of the Greek Empire started by Alexander the Great, which in the space of 10 years, he just conquered close to the whole known world. Yeah, he went from Greece all the way to India and back again. Verse 7, after this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast. And this isn't likened to any particular beast. It's described as dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong. That could, just use your imagination there. And it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. So notice the 10 horns. We're going to see that come back, and that's going to be an identifier. It will help us. Verse 8, while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn. So it had 10 horns. And now a little horn comes up from that strange beast, and then the horns, and this little horn came up among them. And three of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man. So again, we have something that's not just beastly, but like a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. So we've got this other horn, this little one. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Now, Ancient of Days, there's only one, there's only one individual that could be. That's God. The Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. Notice it's God personified. God doesn't have hair. He doesn't necessarily wear clothes. He's a spirit. But this is imagery. And in the imagery, his throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. Sort of interesting that the throne of God had wheels. That's a different topic, but just sort of make a note of that. And so he has the throne and the wheel. Verse 10, a river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were open. Let's talk of judgment. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. Remember, that little horn was still there. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. So the judgment takes place, and the beast is destroyed. So we had the beast. It's destroyed. The little horn is destroyed. Everything's destroyed. Verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them, even though they're not in the ruling class. They're still around for an appointed period of time. Verse 13, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. Now, this isn't the Ancient of Days. This is another individual. One like a son of man. We had one like a lion. We had one like a bear. One like a leopard. This is one like a son of man. He came up to the Ancient of Days. So he's not the Ancient of Days. He comes up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him, that is the one like a son of man, was given dominion, glory, here it is, and a kingdom. Remember, we said we're looking for the kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and those of of every language, men of every language, might serve him. Who's the him? That's the one like the Son of Man. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So the story ends, the vision ends with the kingdom being established that will not end, that will not pass away, that will not be destroyed. Now, Daniel chapter 2 had a similar set of visions. We didn't start there. We started here in Daniel 7. Daniel 7 had the visions of beasts coming up from the sea. Daniel chapter 2 had a vision of a great statue, but they are really, even though they're separated by a number of chapters, they are parallel visions. In both cases, they represent kings and kingdoms. In Daniel chapter 2, it started off with a head of fine gold, and that was Babylon. Now we see the lion with wings. We said that was Babylon. In Daniel chapter 2, you start with the head, and you work your eye just works its way down to the breast and arms of silver. Likewise, Daniel 7 had the bear with the three teeth in it, ribs in its teeth. We suggested that's the Medes and the Persians, and also they pull in Lydia as part of that as well. So we started with Babylon. Here's a map of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, and it took in Mesopotamia, and of course he captured Jerusalem, and he goes all the way to Egypt, and doesn't take all of Egypt, but just does win a battle there. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar, his empire is still there, but it doesn't grow any further. And after a few generations, it's only nominally the empire, and a new kingdom arises in the east. That to the east of Babylon, we have the Medes and the Persians. You have one king who binds these together. His name is Cyrus the Great. The story goes that his father was a Persian, his mother was a Mede, and so he brings in these two kingdoms and makes them one. Then after that, he marches against Lydia. Actually, Lydia has declared war on him, and he takes that and makes it part of his kingdom. He comes down to Babylon and takes Babylon really without a fight. And Babylon just opens their gates to him, and he actually Cyrus doesn't do this, but his descendants, his son Cambyses, marches against Egypt and captures all of Egypt. Egypt actually becomes part of the Persian Empire. Later on, a future Persian king, first Darius and then Xerxes, they make an attempt to invade Greece. That doesn't go so well, so they eventually just sort of leave Greece alone. But their kingdom stretches then from Lydia all the way to India, a very large kingdom. Back to our chart. So we had Babylon, the Medes and the Persians. Next, we had in Daniel chapter 2, the belly and the thigh of bronze. In Daniel 7, that was the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. That's the Greek Empire. That's Alexander the Great. Again, let's look at our map. And Alexander, he comes on the scene. The Persian Empire is there, and he leaves Macedonia in northern Greece and marches in just the space of 10 years, going not only capturing Babylon, but going all the way to India before he turns around and comes back. And he's about 33 years old when he gets back to Babylon, and there he dies, and his kingdom breaks up, but it still remains in the hands of various Greek generals. So the Greek Empire, even though initially it's Alexander for about 10 years, it moves with lightning rapidity. But then when he dies, now it continues as a number of Greek empires, not just one empire any longer. And then this is going to be followed in Daniel chapter 2. It's legs of iron and clay and 10 toes. And notice I put some question marks. Is this Antiochus? Is this the Roman Empire? And we're not going to spend too much time looking at Rome. We'll see that in a future class. But I am going to introduce to you this individual by the name of Antiochus, and by the time he comes along, there's a few of them. So he is Antiochus the Fourth, and this is described in Daniel 7. There's a beast with iron teeth and 10 horns, but out from that, remember, comes, because Alexander's empire is just sort of split in all directions, but from that comes a single horn, and that's where our attention is drawn. So in Daniel 2, all the previous kingdoms, and we're bouncing all the way to the end, all the previous kingdoms are destroyed by a stone that is cut without hands. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In Daniel 7, we saw the Ancient of Days takes the seat and passes judgment. Really what this is saying, and Jesus comes. In Daniel 2, a new kingdom is established that will never be destroyed. In Daniel 7, his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. So you can see Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 are in parallel as they tell essentially the same story with two different symbolic narratives. Now, when we turn the page to Daniel chapter 8, there's another series of visions that line up not so much with Daniel 2, but with Daniel 7, and in particular, those references to the horns. So in Daniel 7, remember we had the dream comes in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel 8 comes a few years later, in the third year of the same king, the reign of Belshazzar the king. In Daniel 7, we saw these four beasts representing Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, Greece, and we put a question mark about the other kingdom. I'm going to leave that just for a second. In Daniel chapter 8, it's not four beasts, it's only two animals, and you have a ram standing by a canal, and it is attacked by a goat coming from the west. And then Daniel himself tells you how you're to understand this, that the ram standing by the canal represents the Medes and the Persians, and that the goat coming from the west, that represents Greece. So notice we don't have Babylon, and we don't have the other kingdom per se. But in Daniel 7, remember the terrible beast has 10 horns. And in Daniel 8, the large horn is broken and gives way to 10 horns. So we're back to 10 horns without even having had the other kingdom. But our eye is on the horns and these 10 horns that are mentioned here. In Daniel chapter 7, out comes a small horn that pulls up the three previous horns, uh, okay, that utters great boasts, that makes alterations in times and law, that wages war against saints, and, at least for a time, wins against them. In Daniel 8, out comes a small horn, so you've got small horn, that grows exceedingly, that magnifies itself against heaven, that removes the regular sacrifice and throws down the temple and flings truth to the ground. So, in other words, in both cases, there's this small horn, this individual that has at least for a time victory and is against God and is doing things against the law, alterations and sacrifices and throwing the temple to the ground, and is winning against the people of God. Now, the story of how this takes place. Remember, I said Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is broken up. And two of many of the kings that come out of this, these are Greek generals of Alexander, but they established themselves. And there's a number of others we could look at, but we're not going to. We're just going to look at these two. Seleucus, who takes control of Mesopotamia, and before it's over, he gets a good chunk of Anatolia, what we call Turkey today, with his base in the city of Antioch. In fact, the word Antioch comes from his father, that was his name. And so the city of Antioch becomes his capital, named after the father of Seleucus. And so we have both Seleucus and a number of his descendants, some of who are called Antiochans or Antiochus, and some of who are called Seleucus. And so I'm going to refer to them as the Seleucids until we get to the fourth, whose name is Antiochus IV. Ptolemy is another general of Alexander. Ptolemies are easy because Ptolemy reigns, and then his son and his grandson, his great grandson, and you have 12 different generations of Ptolemies, and it's easy because they're all named Ptolemy. So if you get the first one right, then you're going to get the whole line of Ptolemies. The very last one, after the 12th, you have Ptolemy the 13th, but his sister really grabs command, and his sister is named Cleopatra, and you've heard of Cleopatra from Egypt. She's Greek. These are all Greeks that we're talking about. Well, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies aren't always playing nice together. And in the middle is the little kingdom of Judah. And so Antiochus IV sets out to go. First of all, what he does is he goes against Judah and he makes some appointments as to who is going to be the high priest. He actually has the high priest murdered and puts his own man who is going to take some of the temple monies and send it personally to him. But he makes appointments in Judah, and he passes a series of anti-Jewish laws. He says, you Jewish people, your problem is your religion. You need to be good Greeks and worship Zeus and sacrifice pigs. And I mean, he's got a whole list of things that he wants to do away with and things that he wants to establish in Judah. And he goes against Rome, or not Rome, he goes against Ptolemy, and Rome steps in and says, you can't do that, go home. So we have Seleucus with Antiochus the Fourth. He's the one who's reigning, and he goes against the Ptolemy, wins big, and Rome sends a delegate saying, "Get out immediately, pack up your bags, go home." And Antiochus does so. He actually packs up at the word of Rome, because the Romans are sort of, they're not really big, but they're strong and they're disciplined, and he doesn't want to fight them. He's sort of smart as to who he can take and who he can't. Uh, and so he packs up and goes home. And meanwhile, back in Judah, they think they've actually heard that somebody from Rome came, and they think that Antiochus has been killed. And they're celebrating and throwing a big party, and he's very much alive, and he comes against Judah now. And his forces against Judah become that much more intense until a group of priests revolt, a family of priests known as the Hasmoneans. Actually, they get the nickname the Maccabees. This is called the Maccabean Revolt. They're called that because that the word Maccabee means a hammer, and they really hammer Antiochus and his forces, and so they revolt. This takes place in 166 BC, and they recapture their temple that Antiochus had actually gone into the temple and put a big statue of himself in the temple. Said, "That's your new god. Worship that." It was supposed to be Zeus, but it sort of looked like Antiochus. Um, and so they liberate the temple, and they fight a long-standing war for independence against the Seleucids and against Antiochus. And finally they win. Now Antiochus, they don't kill him, but he's got other problems in other places, and eventually he dies. And eventually the Jewish people under the Maccabees regain their independence, at least for a time. Now it's not going to last, but for a while they are free not under kings who are descended of David, but under these priests who now make themselves as kings. Now in Daniel 7, we said the saints are given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. In Daniel 8, we read that this little horn endures for 2,300 mornings and evenings. If you do the math, and how does that relate to, remember, in every day you have a morning and an evening, and then how does that relate in terms of years? That's around 3.5 years, which happens to be the amount of time that Antiochus and his people held onto the temple as they had desecrated it and were sacrificing pigs in it, and this big giant statue that was just simply an abomination that was in the temple. So in both cases, we see, notice, time, times, and half a time sounds a bit like 3.5 years, in the same way 2,300 mornings and evenings does. And then Daniel 7 says, and then sovereignty, dominion, and greatness are given to the saints of the Most High. In Daniel chapter 8, then the holy place will be properly restored. Remember, it was by the Maccabees. So initially, both of these look, at least to a point, like they are fulfilled by the Maccabees, by those priests that raised up and brought independence to Israel. But so this is initially fulfilled in the Maccabees, but I would suggest that the ultimate fulfillment is seen in Jesus, in Christ, who wins the complete dominion and greatness and the long-lasting, everlasting kingdom, because the kingdom of the Maccabees was not everlasting. It was followed by Rome, and Rome came in and conquered them and took over and ruled for a time, and history has gone on since then. So I think the more complete fulfillment, the permanent fulfillment, was that which Jesus had brought. Now, why do I say that? I say that at least one reason is because Jesus, when he came to the temple, he stood somewhere in the temple complex, not in the very inside part, but he said that there will be in the holy place, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And so he describes what Antiochus did, but then he said, when you see that, head to the mountains because bad things are going to happen. And I can see his disciples scratching their heads saying, wait a minute, that that happened 168 years ago. Why are you talking about that now? Because it would happen again, and Jesus said so. But we'll look at that in a future class.